Tell me when. Okay. All right. So we're here for this afternoon's discussion, which will center on Alexander Hamilton, his 4 reports to the U.S. Congress at the beginning of the 1790s, which had a phenomenal impact on the direction of the nation and are the basis of what LaRouche defines as the 4 laws necessary to organize a U.S. recovery now. So just to start quickly in terms of a political update, and then we'll turn to Hamilton more directly. We're emphasizing, Lynn is emphasizing, LaRouche is emphasizing that people have just got to get over being scared, get out and fight to win. The war danger is very real. It's becoming, visceral for a lot of people. It's popping up on Facebook, social media. There's more and more articles. People are worrying about it. We're getting phone calls into the office and that kind of thing. And then there's the Jerry Springer show, the Trump versus Hillary presidential election mud wrestling match with all that that entails, which is also having a demoralizing effect on the American people. But there's no reason to be demoralized. There's hysteria on the part of the enemy. You have a breakdown of the financial system, their system, not the American system. This is the opportunity to revive the American system. And we have with the World Land Bridge, the New Silk Road, we have more than half of the world. If you take the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, for example, it's somewhere now between 70 and 100 countries that have joined that institution. You have much of the world moving into a new architecture and a new direction. And we have right now opening today in India, you have in Goa, India, you have the BRICS summit of the 5 leading large developing countries. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa are now meeting, and there's projects, there's plans, there's increased coordination, and including on Syria, on Syrian reconstruction that's on the agenda there. So it's not as if we're somehow alone, and it's not as if the world is somehow just headed over the cliff. If we can free the United States from Obama and his mad team, including Radiation Ashton Carter, we can steer the United States into alliance with this one belt, one road, this new Silk Road perspective for development. Let me just say, again, just picking up on some comments that Mr. LaRouche made in the last 24 hours, as regarding this whole media pornography over Trump's past record or purported past record, as the case may be. Clearly, Mr. LaRouche was saying this was a setup. If you go back to the last debate with Anderson Cooper, who happens to be a Vanderbilt, tying this back to early Americana and so forth. But Anderson Cooper is a member of the Vanderbilt family. If you saw that debate, if you were unfortunate enough to see that debate, he asked Trump whether his taped interviews with his locker room talk was just talk, or whether it had actually been followed through with an action. And of course, he drew Trump out on that. And then lo and behold, immediately following it, the media unloaded, and all of these ladies came stepping forward to report that they had been assaulted in one form or another by Donald Trump. Well, what was the context? Well, the context was the WikiLeaks dumps, the new materials coming out on Hillary Clinton, including that Citigroup, led by Robert Rubin, a leadership group within Citigroup, chose Obama's first administration, his first cabinet. That Hillary in 2013 was pounding the table Khrushchev style, saying we were going to encircle China with missile defense systems. Further, in 2014, you have Hillary Clinton's email to Podesta spelling out her knowledge that Saudi Arabia, together with Qatar, were providing logistics and financing to Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, ISIS, and so on, that was known. Of course, these are our so-called allies. So Hillary stands completely exposed herself, but maybe exposure is the wrong word to use in the context of everything that's being, that's out there right now altogether. So Mr. LaRouche's point was, this is up to the American people. This is not a matter of these candidates. The American people are angry. The collapse of the Obama healthcare system, which is now clear, I think, to everyone, with rates now going up 50, 60, 70% for those that are using the government's online program, sign-up programs. Those programs are being dumped right and left to get into another program. Whoa, you can get that program, but the rate is 50%, 60%, 70% more, and your coverage is less. Maybe you have a $5,000 deductible, maybe a $6,000, and so on. People are ending up with no health care whatsoever. In this context, the American people are just damn angry. And I think that's just really got to sink in. I think it was Tulsi Gabbard of Ohio, current congresswoman for re-election. Duckworth. Oh yeah, Tammy Duckworth. I get those two names mixed up. Too good congresswoman. But Duckworth of Ohio was being interviewed this last week and kind of pushed on Trump. Trump, what do you have to say about Trump? Of course, Duckworth is a Democrat, and she just brushed it aside and said, look, what people want to hear about is the economy. They're hurting. It's a question of jobs and health care. This is what people want addressed. And she's clearly reflecting the blue collar, if you will, real America out there that is angry and increasingly angry, regardless of race, creed, or color. So this is not going to be suppressed by this election. Regardless of who wins the election, this anger is going to continue to come forward and increasingly shape what goes forward in terms of U.S. politics. Now, on the war danger, very briefly, we've just had in the last night, we had the meeting of Obama with his national security team, with the Joint Chiefs of Staff at Obama's request, spelling out the options, so-called options regarding Syria. And we don't have any report on that yet, but it's been generally reported on the nature of these proposals in general terms, as spelled out from the Obama administration to the Joint Chiefs, not the other way around. The Joint Chiefs just have to fulfill the request of the president and the president's team. They're not calling the shots. But those options, 4 or 5 options, range from assault on Russian and Syrian aircraft, a no-fly zone over Syria or the northern portion of Syria, on through to that arming of the jihadis with man-pads and other sophisticated weapons. Virtually all of that, I should just say all of it, is really a calculated escalation towards thermonuclear war. None of that is anything else but that. And it's clear on the part of Russia, of President Putin of Russia, of Xi Jinping of China, of Modi of India, that they are not backing down. They're going to defend their national sovereignty and the national sovereignty of other nations. And so that means that this only means an escalation, as I said, towards thermonuclear war. So again, this is up to the American people. to pull this back, to pull us back from the brink. In that regard as well, Vice President Biden is now being quoted in the press, starting in Europe and now in the United States press, based on, I think, excerpts that are now published of a Meet the Press interview, which will be coming out. It's already been taped, with Vice President Biden saying that we are preparing, to send President Putin a message, and we'll do it in our own time, at our own time and choosing. And specifically what is being talked about, at least from the outtakes and what's been extrapolated, I guess you could say, from them, is that cyber warfare operations are being prepared. And the Russian response has been to simply say that this is very rude. They're not exactly terrified by this.
I don't think they could possibly go on a cyber war against Russia.
Well, it's again, this is only if you understand that this is an insane, but calculated, but insane, literally insane, drive towards World War III. There's not anything that Russia or China are going to, or India or whoever, or the Philippines, Duterte is going to do, is going to do in terms of capitulation in the face of these kinds of threats or these kinds of operations. Informed U.S. military people, current and retired, have already responded, stating, look, this has all been reviewed before. There's certain things we can do, but then the Russians can do certain things in other places that will hurt us even more. And so you can see the tit for tat that's set up here. So that's what's going on, is an escalation towards what some want to make the inevitable. So that is just by way of just bringing people up to date as much as I can in terms of the immediate situation, and it really makes the importance of Alexander Hamilton that much more so. I will just in terms of an update, there's of course the meeting going on in Lausanne, Switzerland. Kerry is there, Secretary of State Kerry, Foreign Minister Lavrov from Russia, but Turkey, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Zarif is there from Iran, Egypt and Iraq are represented, and this is an attempt to restart negotiations in some sense. The Russians are saying, Lavrov was very clear, saying that he has no expectations from this meeting. The Russians are simply going to present a clean perspective, clear and clean perspective. The issue is the separation of the so-called moderates from al-Nusra, al-Qaeda. And that's the key issue as far as the Russians see it, and that's how they've always seen it, and that is the fundamental issue. If you're going to bring about a solution in Syria, you have to stop utilizing terrorists as a stand-in for U.S. military operations. You've got to quit playing this game, and I think it's clear that otherwise we're looking at some bloody hell. Now, moving on then to the question of Hamilton. This is not separate. I think it's important for me to emphasize this, particularly given the stark nature of the situation we're in. What Mr. LaRouche is emphasizing, what we're emphasizing, is the underpinnings of the war danger is the breakdown of the monetarist system in the transatlantic region. That is what's blowing up. Everyone has seen the articles, at least seen the coverage of our banking crisis. Most recently, Wells Fargo, Deutsche Bank, J.P. Morgan Chase, and so forth. This monetary system is nothing but organized theft at this point. The attempt to steal from depositors, to create phony accounts, anything to move money and move it into speculation. anything to hold the bubble together. The IMF World Bank meeting in Washington, D.C., their annual fall meeting, just occurred. There was no agreements. There was no outcomes in terms of a way forward. There was no agreement on any kind of management of the Deutsche Bank crisis, which has a $14 billion Department of Justice penalty hanging over it on top of everything else. And the counterparties to Deutsche Bank is every major bank, every big too big to fail bank in the world. From JP Morgan to Barclays to Bank Paribas, they're all counterparties. And the Deutsche Bank goes, the system goes. Now this is blowing up. And it's blowing up, though more fundamentally, it's blowing up because there's no real economy left in the transatlantic region. Productivity is zip. Any increases in productivity essentially has disappeared. There's no net investment into manufacturing. Manufacturing unemployment is continuing to decline. Output in manufacturing is continuing to decline month to month. And so what's happening with Obamacare is just the consequence. You know, if there's no pie, there's nothing to divide up and to go around. And so it's all folding in, collapsing in on itself. So under these conditions, the financial oligarchy centered in London, extending into the United States and elsewhere, into continental Europe, is saying, okay, we've got one weapon, and that's our weapons. It's the US military. That's our primary recourse. As long as we have Obama in there, or some abomination like Obama in there, this is what we can try to use to impose emergency decrees. It's what we can utilize to try to beat other nations into line, to break the back of this new Silk Road, One Belt, One Road initiative coming out of Eurasia, to break the doors down on these countries and open up new sources of loot to try to hold on, to sustain ourselves. But that's all we have left, and damn it, we're going to use it, and we've run the world, and we're going to keep running it, and don't get in our way. You know, it's this kind of, you know, our way or the highway and approach. So, all right, so what's the solution? Well, we can say we don't want war. People could go out in the street and march and say we don't want war. The point is, bankrupt these people. They're bankrupt already. Put them through bankruptcy. You know, Chapter 11 reorganization of the financial system. This is what has to be done. The same way that with JASTA, with the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act, that we put through the US Senate and Congress just a matter of weeks ago, with that same kind of spirit in the American people on the offensive, angry but on the offensive, we can ram through Glass Steagall, and with it the following other three laws, as LaRouche is spelling them out, to organize an economic recovery. So that's the context in which it's important now that more Americans learn from the inside out who Alexander Hamilton is and what the American system is that he, in a singular way, created. And these 4 reports that he produced at the request of the US Congress, starting in 1790, and which became the building blocks of the United States, are just really the singular material to study. And you're talking about a couple hundred pages total. You're talking about 30, 40 pages a piece for these reports. I think the defense of the National Bank, I think, is about half that length. So we're going to discuss the first 2 today. You can go ahead and put up the first slide here, just to give a sense of Alexander Hamilton himself. Just so many of you may have some sense of him, but maybe you don't. Alexander Hamilton was born in 1757 in the West Indies. He was born out of wedlock to a Scottish merchant and his common law wife, the daughter of a Huguenot physician. As a result, he spoke English and fluent French. His parents divorced or separated. By the time he was 11, he and his brother were a year or 2 apart. and his mother died when he was just a few years older. The father was out of the scene, and so he essentially was an orphan. He went to work in his early teens for a merchant house, and ended up basically running that store and mercantile outlet at a very young age. His aunts and others helped raise money to send him to New York to go to college, because he was obviously an extremely intelligent and mature individual for his age. He entered college in New Jersey in 1772, and then moved to King's College, where he built a friendship with three other individuals, to most importantly to mention, Robert Livingston, Gouverneur Morris, not governor, but Gouverneur Morris, and John Jay, who were all at King's College. The others older than he. They had already graduated. But that foursome became the core of what Robert Ingram has reported in his groundbreaking work to be really the core of the New York administration of George Washington. That the George Washington administration was an administration that developed and centered around these four unique individuals who created the Constitution, created the First Bank of the United States, carried out the reforms of the U.S. debt, and so on. Hamilton left. This is what he looked like when he was in his late teens. He left King's College, which is now Columbia University, and became a captain of a artillery unit, and served in Long Island and the New Jersey campaigns. Came to the attention of George Washington, who made him his aide-de-camp, and he served with him through and beyond Valley Forge, as did John Jay and other important Americans. John Morris, who we'll come back to, was at Valley Forge. Gouverneur Morris was at Valley Forge. Not Robert Morris, but John Jay and Gouverneur Morris were there, along with Hamilton and others. 10,000 troops marched into Valley Forge for that winter. 25% lost their lives there, that winter. Hamilton went on to lead a battalion at Yorktown, and played a significant role there, including in the surrender. And in 1786, just to keep track, he's 31 years old. He authored the draft report, the so-called Annapolis Resolution, that resulted in the Constitutional Convention of the following year. And he then was one of the key figures in the Constitutional Convention. In fact, at one point taking the floor for an entire day at the request of George Washington to organize the fellow delegates around creating a strong central government and presidency. So this is a little bit of the background. Gouverneur Morris wrote the preamble of the Constitution as a member of Hamilton's committee, which oversaw the writing of what became the preamble, the statement of principle that guides the Constitution in its entirety. So that's a little bit of background. That's taking us up to 1786, 1787, and then he led the campaign to ratify the Constitution the following year. So Hamilton, I'm emphasizing, was in the thick of it, and Robert Ingram's paper, which we can get to you if you need a link, we can email it to, just let people know here at the office, or you can go to the Schiller Institute website, the Executive Intelligence Review website, or the LaRouche website. If you put in Robert Ingram in the search engine, you'll probably come up with the article, but it's titled "Manhattan's Struggle for for Human Freedom Against the Slave Power of Virginia. And it was published May 8th of last year, 2015. And that's worth a very careful study. Now, the Constitution having been ratified in 2088, the country was a mess. The Constitution, the ratification of the Constitution, the creation of a central government, the creation of the power of essentially placing in the hands of the U.S. government the power of producing monies, of currency for circulation, taking this away from under the Constitution of the states, and similar measures centralized responsibility. But the economy was indebted, massively indebted, to the tune of just shy of $80 million, which was an enormous sum of money for the 13 colonies in those days and at the value of currency at that time. But approximately $80 million, $40 million domestically. These were in terms of loans made during the war, or in some cases seizures and with promises to pay back later. The continental dollar, not worth the continental, the valued currency. People had these money which had become worthless. We had a debt of some $12 million foreign, and then there was the debt of the states, $25 million. And so the question was, how were we going to manage this situation in the United States? The Congress, among its first actions, was the passage of a tariff, July 4th, 1789, tariff and tonnage fees. And that became, for the next 100 years, the primary basis, the primary taxation base of the U.S. government. It funded the Louisiana Purchase, the Oregon Purchase, the portion of the Transcontinental Railroad, in Lincoln's time, and so forth. So that it was incredibly important. And the Customs Union and Customs Service was created, and so forth. In September of 1789, the Congress created the executive departments, and Hamilton was made Secretary of the Treasury, and facing this debt, and there being no agreement among the 13 colonies as to how to manage the debt. He was requested to write. This was at the end of 1789. To write an assessment of a plan, and to argue for a specific plan that Congress could take up and that might work. And the result was the report on the public credit. And so we're going to take that. You can go on to the next slide. This is how he looked like as aide-de-camp. This is what he looked like in his maturity. I'll go on to the next slide. Well, I put this up here. This is what drove Alexander Hamilton. Manufacturing, progress, scientific and technological progress, and we're going to get to more of this in the next couple of weeks. But the third report, or fourth report, the report on manufactures by Hamilton, spells out what the government had to do to carry out, the kinds of projects, moonshot type programs of his own day to advance the U.S. economy and advance the human minds of its citizenry. And I put this up, Xi Jinping, this is just from a couple of months ago. The Chinese government announced a new program that their government now is going to center its entire economic program around the word innovation, science and innovation. And the quote there just should sound familiar to you. It's exactly what Hamilton had in mind. It's in fact, in part at least, what came about, not just because of Hamilton's efforts, but the later efforts of people like Lincoln and later with Roosevelt and Kennedy. but this question of scientists being given free rein, resources being made available, we have to recognize changes, we have to advance, we have to innovate, or we'll miss an entire era. If you count, you could contrast where we are today in terms of the United States and say that's exactly where we are at the moment. We're as if we're from on the outside looking in on a process in which much of the rest of the world is moving forward and advancing. And it's like a mirror being held up, really. What Xi Jinping is doing, what India is doing, what other countries in Asia are joining and doing, and countries such as Ecuador and countries in Africa like Ethiopia and so forth, is they're joining them in advancing what was the American system. You know, it has Chinese characteristics, Confucian characteristics, it has Indian Sanskrit characteristics. You know, it's not the same in the details, but in terms of the concept of progress and the role of progress and the role of government to drive progress forward. This is the heart of the American system. The next slide. So when we take up Hamilton's port, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted so he's an elected person in China, because I'm not familiar at all with Chinese politics.
Yes, he's the president.
Because I've never heard that word.
Xi Jinping.
With Chinese, whatever.
Oh.
I hear it, you know, in the United States.
Yeah, well,
Prime Minister, somebody written, but how new is that term in association with China?
Well, without getting too far afield, no, it's a good question. China has, you know, since the 1950s has carried forward, the late 1950s really, began a serious program in space. And really it wasn't until after the Cultural Revolution that geared up into a real national effort, fully supported by the government. But since Deng Xiaoping, since the fall of the Gang of Four, China, with its opening up policy, when so many Chinese students came to the United States and Europe, Deng Xiaoping advocated very openly and publicly that science and technology knowledge was what China needed, and they had to go out in the world and get it, because they had fallen so far behind. And so really it starts there. In terms of the modern period, in terms of China's, drive in this direction.
Is his term going to end, and then they're going to have an election, and then the person is going to?
Oh, well, yes, sure. It's not clear what's going to happen in terms of China. I mean, he may serve another term, but it's not the China. I'm not trying to play expert here on Chinese policy or the Chinese government decision-making process, but there is a consensual aspect to this.
Okay.
That what Deng Xiaoping is not expressing simply his own views, but a consensus that's been reached in the Politburo and the other, the Congress and so forth in China as to China's future direction. And this is they're speaking in terms of the next 5-year plan, and they're speaking in terms of the perspective from here out till say 2030. In terms of an overarching kind of perspective. So, you have an incredible investment in nuclear power going forward. You have an incredible investment in new cities. They're committed to erasing extreme hunger with now 5 years. They've lifted 700 million people out of extreme poverty in the last 25 years. They're going to reduce that to 0 within the next 5 years. The president of the World Bank, who's South Korean, a week ago stated that the only hope of the world ending extreme poverty rested with China because of China's example, that the hopes of doing this in Africa and elsewhere rested in effect on the Chinese model in terms of how to accomplish this. So China is, carrying forward a process which has not just breadth or great ideas within a scientific cadre or something, but it has depth in terms of, you know, a process of lifting the entire population up and forward. And so that's going to continue regardless of transitions in terms of the government.
That's the question. I'm sorry. It's like, if you look at the United States, apparently it's spending like 57 or 60% of the government's income on military. Is it possible for a country to do that and accomplish anything in life, or for there to be any kind of a happy outcome? You know, you talk about like scientific adventure and proceeding. Is it possible to do anything along those lines? We've got that much money being spent, you know, like on war material.
Sure. I understand your question. I think this is why this
got the military now where it is now before we make any progress.
Well, that's very nice, but you know, you're not going to cut the military in half overnight, you know, for political reasons, if not otherwise. But this is why it's so important to actually get at this question of the public debt and how the public debt was handled then and how it has to be handled going forward. How do we actually carry out a sound reorganization of the U.S. economy? We have to understand principles, economic principles. And I think if we continue forward in terms of Hamilton, we'll gain some insight along the way. In other words, it's not merely, another way of putting it is, it's not merely a matter of cutting the defense budget. The question is, right now we don't have an economy that can produce anything. You know, how do we retool? What do we retool for? What are the priorities? How do we build up the economy again? How do we build up the workforce? What kind of educational system is required, and so on. I mean, it's not, you know, if you remember, there was cuts to the U.S. defense budget under George H.W. Bush. You know, I don't recall that we had a great economic recovery. In fact, we got rid of that guy after one term because, you know, as Carville, the advisor to Bill Clinton, said, you know, it's the economy, stupid. The economic crisis, malaise in the country was not addressed simply by cutting the military budget and that sort of thing. Anyway, so let's go deeper. That's what I'm saying. Let me continue.
I'm glad to see our military being designed to meet real needs, you know, rather than just
sure. But let's define. I'm going to move forward here, and we're going to define what the government has to be defined positively in terms of what it's doing, as opposed to what it's not doing. So the government, first of all, today you could say Wall Street's in debt up to its eyeballs, which it is. It's bankrupt, okay? At the time of the conclusion of the American Revolution, it's the U.S. government that's bankrupt, and the country's bankrupt. I mean, it's general poverty. I mean, land prices had fallen 20 to 50%. There was tremendous unemployment. Land was going fallow. You know, it was going back to wilderness because people were leaving the land. Incredible dislocation. Taxes had to be paid in specie, you know, gold and silver. But nobody had gold and silver. So if you had farmland, you couldn't find a buyer because there weren't any buyers. So you couldn't get gold and silver. So you couldn't pay your taxes, so your land was seized. You know, I mean, these sorts of processes were at work. Just like today, the U.S. farm community, ranchers and farmers are in incredible crisis because farm prices have fallen through the floor, and the costs of the inputs are going through the roof. So there's direct parallels here. All right. So how do we deal with this enormous debt? Well, what was proposed by Hamilton was, first of all, that we recognize the important role that money had to play, and specifically, you could say what banks, the role banks had to play in this process. And so here we have it from the report on the National Bank. Well, it's similar, but let's What Hamilton proposes on the report on the national credit, his first report, and then we'll pick it up here in the National Bank, is he proposes that what's critical is that we have to maintain the credit of the United States, the good credit of the United States. There were proposals, including by Madison, that large portions of the debt, the domestic debt, be just basically written off, because a lot of the debt had been purchased by speculators, you know, from people who had originally been given financial paper in exchange for cows and food and ammunition and weapons and pay for soldiers and so forth. That script had been bought, and state bills of credit had been bought by speculators. So Madison said, well, they don't deserve to be repaid. They're just merely speculators. But Hamilton's point was, no, we have to maintain the good credit of the United States. So here's some of what he said, and I'm reading from his report on the credit of the United States. While the observance of that good faith, which is the basis of public credit, is recommended by the strongest inducements of political expediency, it is enforced by considerations of still greater authority. There are arguments for it which rest on the immutable principles of moral obligation, and in proportion as the mind is disposed to contemplate, in the order of providence, an intimate connection between public virtue and public happiness, will be its repugnancy to a violation of those principles. This reflection derives additional strength from the nature of the debt of the United States. It was the price of liberty. The faith of America has been repeatedly pledged for, and with solemnities that give peculiar force to the obligation. There is indeed reason to regret that it has not hitherto been kept, that the necessities of the war, conspiring with inexperience in the subjects of finance, produce direct infractions, and that the subsequent period has been a continued scene of negative violation or non-compliance. But a diminution of this regret arises from the reflection that the last 7 years have exhibited an earnest and uniform effort on the part of the government of the Union through the creation of the Constitution to retrieve the national credit by doing justice to the creditors of the nation, and that the embarrassments of a defective constitution, that is the Confederate Constitution, which defeated this laudable effort, has ceased. And then he goes on a paragraph later, he says, it cannot but merit particular attention that among ourselves the most enlightened friends of good government are those whose expectations are the highest, that we will salvage the national credit. He says, to justify and preserve their confidence, to promote the increasing respectability of the American name, to answer the calls of justice, to restore landed property to its due value, to furnish new resources both in agriculture and commerce, to cement more closely the union of the states, to add to their security against foreign attack. I mean, how can you borrow money to finance a war if you have to finance a defensive war if you don't have any credit? To establish public order on the basis of an upright and liberal policy. These are the great and invaluable ends to be secured by a proper and adequate provision at the present period for the support of public credit. So this is some of what you can read in the report on public credit, and we have it now on our website. You can get it for free. You can download it. You can read it on the site. This is the kind of close reasoning which he's developing in terms of the importance of the public credit. It's not simply we owe it and we need to pay it back. That's part of it. There's a moral obligation. But as well as he goes on to say, agriculture and manufacturers are also promoted by it. Likewise, trade and so forth. And the rate of interest on money will be reduced by restoring the public credit, right? Because interest rates rise when people are unsure of the return. So what he outlines there in the report on public credit, he outlines a program, first of all, of redemption. That rather than liquidating the national debt, that it should circulate at par. That is, that rather than trying to just pay off the debt, which the country didn't have the resources to do, it, essentially would have impoverished the country all over again to try to pay the debt. It'd be like the family starving itself to pay the credit card debt or something, right? Or pay the mortgage. That instead, the key was to restore the value of the debt and allow it to circulate. Because the debt itself was a form of currency. It circulated, you can compare it today as bonds, for example, government bonds, as a form, as collateral in various financial operations and so forth. But in those days, these bills of credit and so forth, or as we'll see with the national bank, the if you will, currency, the banknotes created by the national bank, which is really what they were, banknotes, circulated as currency and had the value, and were restored to the value as if they were gold or silver. They were species. So 13, including 13 billion in arrears of the 40 billion of domestic debt, was going to be salvaged. And along with it, that was the redemption. And along with it was the assumption, that was the term used for the state debt, that the 25 billion owed by the states, which had no way of paying the states, were impoverished. And as he points out in the report, there wasn't a single state that was really willing to increase the tax rates, because if they decreased their tax rate, the business would go to the next state over, So, there was a constant militancy against increasing the taxes, including on the fact that you'd be increasing the taxes on an impoverished population, right? So he says, no, the U.S. government is now going to take over the debt. It's going to take over the debt that the U.S. government, or the U.S., we the people as the United States, are encumbered by from the American Revolutionary War period, including the arrears in terms of interest payments and so forth. And we will take on the state debt. Now, how was this done? By issuing a new loan. The U.S. Treasury, the U.S. government, based on the bill that was passed on July 26th of 1790, stated, we are now offering a new government bond issuance, which you can buy into. Now, how is it possible that you're in debt, you're in hop up your eyeballs, and you're offering a new bond? Well, you can buy into this new bond by turning in your old debt. You're holding on to these bills of credit from the state of Alabama or North Carolina or whatever, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania. You're holding on to Continentals, you're holding on to other script and other instruments that are now virtually worthless. We're going to accept them at their face value. They're actually not written down at their face value. We'll accept them at their face value, and we will give you a return on that face value. And there was different formulations. You had different options. 60% of it could be repaid over a period of 10 years or 20 years at 5 or 6% interest. A portion you would be repaid in land, which you in the western areas of the country, not that far west as we think of it today, but the western part of what was then kind of the frontier of the new nation. And yeah, like Ohio, yeah, at 20 cents an acre. The going rate at that time, and he went through careful calculations, which are in the report. He summarizes them there, as to the value of the land, but the land value is coming up, and so trying to take into these fluctuations and where the price is going, we'll value the land on the frontier at about $1 an acre. So we'll make it available to you buying our new issuance of bonds at 20 cents an acre as a portion of how you will be repaid, in terms of this bond issuance. And so there's different, they were all offered simultaneously. It's like choosing different flavors of ice cream. You could choose how you wanted to be paid back. Basically on a kind of like, as he compared it to an annuity at 6% interest over 20 years and so forth, a portion of land, and a mixture of both and so on. And so this bond offering was grabbed up. Now, how was the U.S. government going to pay this back? Well, in the report on public credit, he specifies how it can be paid off. The foreign debt will be paid off first and foremost with revenues from the tariffs and tonnage, a portion of that. A portion remaining will go to the paying off of the national and state debt. As well, then there's new taxes. There's a excise tax proposed, which is adopted on alcohol, brandy, whiskey, particularly on imported liquors, which, he makes the point. These are damaging. They have a negative effect on the population, on our people. If anything's going to be punished, this is it. And these are of course, these are not required for keeping body and limb together. These are luxuries, but people are attached to their luxuries. So even if the price goes up, the store owners will still be able to sell their whiskey because people will still want it. And therefore, we're going to put the excise taxes on there and on coffee and tea. Anyway, there's a few other items, and he spells out the gradations in terms of brandy, whiskey, domestically produced, foreign imported, different rates and so forth. So excise tax, and this is all adopted, not word for word, but it's worked through Congress and it comes out the other side more or less intact. And then a customs service is set up, a U.S. revenue cutter force of boats is set up to shut down smuggling, including slave smuggling. In 1794, just a couple of years later, the first law against slavery was passed in the United States, not way later, but in 1794, which prohibited Americans from doing business in slaves from the United States. That is, from the U.S., for example, financing ships to go to Africa to bring back slaves and this kind of thing. That was made illegal in 1794. But this was part of the smuggling operations that had to be shut down. So to summarize, specific sources of revenue were earmarked to pay off various portions of the national debt, and it meant paying 40% of the revenue of the country from 1790 to 1800. 40% of the revenues went to paying off the debt, and then and it continued after that, but not at the same levels. But that was about $80 million that was financed in that way, and as a result, the public credit of the nation was restored. The debt of the United States found ready markets when it needed to be sold, in Europe or domestically. The debt outstanding, that is the bonds that have now been issued, the new bonds, right? That was now circulated as a form of currency, paper currency. In the buying and selling, they were accepted. It was as good as gold. It was backed not only by the government, but it was backed by a revenue stream, which is known. And it all came in the context of the Constitution. It was all premised on the power of the federal government, the new government, the federal government, to ensure that these things these monies were collected and so on. And just, in the report on public credit, you'll see he's even specific on ensuring that the Treasury agents and people with the Customs Service, what we would now call the Customs Service, you know, followed proper proper decorum. You know, that people were not shook down for money, the goods were not confiscated, you know, irregularly. You know, that there was a lawful process in which the citizenry were respected in the process. So in a nutshell, that's the report on public credit. And we can remove quickly here to the report on the National Bank, if you're still holding with me. This is
before you ever, all this discussed, before you had a national bank.
right. This is all before, and now he moves immediately. He's immediately out. I mean, this is all occurring, right? Boom, 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 right? This is, we just had the 1787.
Does this stuff have to be paid off before you can have a national bank for some reason?
Well, you could say, yeah, really, you know, you had to get the horse before the cart, right? I mean, if you didn't stabilize the national credit, how could you establish a bank? Because if people were going to invest in a bank, they had to have confidence in that bank. Okay, so yeah, good question. Okay, here from the report on the National Bank. We've had it up on the screen for some time. This idea of a bank. There was only at the time of the National Bank was even formed. This is before it was formed. There was only three other banks in the country. The Bank of North America, which had been formed by John Morris in the latter part of the American Revolutionary War. There was a bank in Massachusetts. There was a bank of Maryland, and a little bit later a bank of Providence. But they were very small banks. In fact, the Bank of North America was quickly turned into simply a state bank, in effect. So banking was not something like everybody knew about. Banks didn't exist. They just didn't exist. We can come back to that. But this idea of a bank, which appears rather subtle and abstract, how that could help people. Because there are suspicions about banks, lots of suspicions.
Still are.
Rather subtle and abstract, in a general form, may be made obvious and palpable by entering into a few particulars. It is evident, for instance, that the money which a merchant keeps in this chest, waiting for a favorable opportunity to employ it, produces nothing till that opportunity arrives. But instead of locking it up in this manner, he either deposits it in a bank or invests it in the stock of a bank. That becomes a part owner of it. It yields a profit during the interval, in which he partakes or not according to the choice he may have made of being a depositor or a proprietor. And when he may have made, and when any advantageous speculation of offers, in order to be able to embrace it, he has only to withdraw his money if a depositor, or if a proprietor, to obtain a new loan.
You define what he means by the word speculation there. I'm serious.
He's using the term, and he's using an example, as you saw, of a merchant. So a merchant, it's kind of the adage of buy cheap, sell dear. Where are the opportunities? And that merchant is probably not producing anything himself. So he's using that as an example. And there's, of course, a merchant class, and a tremendous amount of trade going on, and more trade that would be going on.
So it's a commodities thing.
Well, he's in this example, but he's concerned, as I quoted earlier, he's concerned about agriculture and manufacturing. But he's using this as a simple example of saying, well, how does a bank work? How does a bank actually multiply the amount of money in circulation, to meet needs? Because there's not enough money. This is a cry of agrarians. It's the cry of everyone that there's not enough money.
He's using that term in the meaning of speculative philosophy. I mean, you don't know exactly. If you go and buy 100 bales of hay, you don't absolutely know that somebody's going to need 100 bales of hay. You might be stuck with 80 bales of hay. You just don't know. That's what he means by it, speculative.
Well, that's a fair addition. Yeah, that's fair. Yep. So, of course, the point being that if you're not using your money and you can deposit in a bank and get interest, unlike today, which you get no interest, and soon if Rogoff and what is the Harvard economist is saying that soon we may have negative interest rates of 6% negative rates. In other words, you'll pay 6% per annum to put your money in a bank. But anyway, in a sane right side up world, you can put your money in a bank, but then the money gets used by somebody else while you're not using it, and so on. Okay, so that's a simple example. Go ahead with the next step. Or to dispose of a stock. An alternative seldom or never attended with difficulty when the affairs of the institution are in a prosperous train. His money thus deposited or invested is a fund upon which himself and others can borrow to a much larger amount. It is a well-established fact that banks, and here he's looking towards Europe and how banks operated there, that banks in good credit can circulate a far larger sum than the actual quantum of their capital in gold and silver. The extent of the possible excess seems indeterminate, though it has been conjecturally stated at a proportion of 2 or 3 to 1. This faculty is produced in various ways. First, a great portion of the notes which are issued or passed current as cash, that is banknotes, are indefinitely suspended in circulation from the confidence which each holder has, which he can at any moment turn them into gold and silver. That is the banknote, I pay him. He doesn't want to run down to the bank and get gold or silver for it. That, it's not worth the trouble. He can turn around and pay who he has to pay with that, with some of those banknotes, and so on and so forth, right? It's what we think of as the role of currency today. Federal Reserve notes in a certain way.
Well, they used to say silver certificate.
Yeah.
And you could use it.
Right. So go ahead, the next one. Now, this is, there still was a lot of nervousness, and not just in the population, but in the Congress. I mean, there's real resistance. The paper on the public credit, that went over. Basically, that got pretty much unanimous support, and it went through and it went into effect. But when it came to creating
Those are the guys that had the notes that owned the debt. They wanted to get rid of it and turn it into something else.
oh well, that was a small component of it, but not a major. It was a much broader base of people to gain from the reorganization of the national debt and creating a sound current public credit than just the congressman.
But those are the guys that
No, you really missed the boat if you think that's what was going on. We can come back and talk about it in the question and answer period.
As soon as Uncle Sam said that we're going to honor this debt, at face value, these pieces of paper, which people were just,
sitting on, right, went up,
just skyrocketed.
Even when it was just in the Congress being debated, the value went up to 25, 50%. Even at the time that, and he talks about it in the paper on public credit, that already just in the fact that Congress is discussing this idea is already.
Because Jefferson wanted to repudiate a lot of it, or downing the fact that they changed hands at a discount.
Oh, sure. Anyway, let's try to keep this thing rolling along. But there were still a lot of doubts, including in the U.S. Congress. A lot of them were not happy with a national bank idea. And a lot of them were nervous even about but they were led along with it in terms of the federal government buying the state debt, because they saw it as a consolidation of power, in federal hands as opposed to their hands, at the local level, right? Particularly in the South. but not only in the South. And I think this bears on the principle of Glass Steagall, which is the first of the 4 laws that LaRouche is discussing in terms of how you reorganize the banking system. Not that you have to go from 1 to 4 in that order necessarily, but really that's where you have to start practically, if not conceptually. Let's just read here. This is a little later on in the report on the national bank, on a national bank, by Hamilton. The judgment of many concerning them has no doubt been perplexed by the misinterpretation of appearances, which were to be ascribed to other causes, not to the existence of banks or bills of credit and paper currencies during the American Revolutionary period. The general devastation of personal property occasioned by the late war naturally produced, on the one hand, a great demand for money, and on the other, a great deficiency of it to answer the demand. Some injudicious laws which grew out of the public distresses by impairing confidence and causing a part of the inadequate sum in the country to be locked up, aggravated the evil. The dissipated habits contracted by many individuals during the war, which after the peace plunged them into experiences beyond their incomes. The number of adventurers without capital, and in many instances without information, who at that epoch rushed into trade and were obliged to make any sacrifices to support a transient credit, that is, to pay usurious rates. The employment of considerable sums in speculations upon the public debt, we've already been talking about, which from its unsettled state was incapable of becoming itself a substitute. And you can go on to the next. In other words, all these circumstances concurring necessarily led to usurious borrowing, produced most of the inconveniences, and were the true causes of most of the appearances, where the banks were established, have been by some erroneously placed to their account, a mistake which they might easily have avoided by turning their eyes towards places where there were no banks, and where nonetheless the same evils would have been perceived to exist even in a greater degree than where those institutions had obtained. In other words, the speculation that we've seen, that Roosevelt faced, that had already was really running rampant in the country by the end of the 19th century and coming back with a vengeance and running up into the 29 crash, and then being dealt with by Glass Steagall and other measures in the 30s, beginning in 1933, but then coming back after the assassination of John F. Kennedy in particular, and then the repeal of Glass Steagall. The building up of a financial oligarchy really mirrors this kind of cannibalistic, self-destructive process, which the American people had been through in a more primitive way in the period immediately after the American Revolution. And so what Hamilton's posing here is the role of government through the creation of a national bank to now order the affairs based on a constitution now put in place to ensure that this does not occur going forward. That we're now moving forward to stabilizing the affairs of the nation and the financial activity. An important reason why the reenactment of Glass Steagall is required today. I think you can go to the next one. And he addresses it here. This is just a continuation of the same paragraphs. These evils have either ceased or have been greatly mitigated. Their more complete extinction may be looked for from that additional security to property which the Constitution of the United States happily gives, a circumstance of prodigious moment in the scale both of public and private prosperity. From the attraction of foreign capital under the auspices of that security, to be employed upon objects and enterprises for which the state of this country opens a wide and inviting field, from the consistency and stability which the public debt is fast acquiring, as well as the public opinion at home and abroad, as in fact, from the augmentation of capital, which that circumstance and the quarterly yearly payment of interest will afford, and from the most copious circulation, which will likely to be created by a well-constituted national bank. Right? So, everyone, I guess, got one of the, okay. I gave people a handout. I think it got around the room. Everyone, yep. And this is not the conclusion, but it's what this and more is a lead up to. Very carefully reasoned and developed. But then he turns.
I would like to see an IQ reading of this guy, you know, because this is like reading Nietzsche, where you've got one sentence taking the whole page. You know, the words all at the bottom or something like that.
Well, I wouldn't compare him to Nietzsche, but yeah, he was a genius. There's no, this period produced geniuses.
Oh, yeah. I mean, read the Federalist Papers if you want to have a shot.
Well, yes, and he wrote over half the Federalist Papers.
And they were popular. And they were put up in taverns, tacked on the wall. People read them.
Yep.
People can't do that today.
Well, let's continue here. So from the report on the National Bank, continuing on this, what we have now here, and I don't have this for the screen. Well, I have some portions for the screen. What you have a handout of is where he now says, okay, well, we've discussed this in terms of what's agreeable and desirable and what people disagree with, but that's all basically talking. Let me now submit a plan based on what we've discussed here so far in this paper. Here's the plan. Here's what I'm proposing. And so what you have here, Roman numeraled, and then continuing to the end of the document. So that's about 6 pages. Is that plan? And of course a kind of recapitulation at the end. So I'd like to draw your attention to, you can obviously read it, and you'll see how closely reasoned it is in terms of kind of offsetting, kind of balance of powers, if you will, kinds of moves. That the tendency for people to be suspicious of the board members of a bank making decisions behind closed doors as to where money will go and where it won't go, what you have to do to offset that, how there has to be a rotation in the board membership, but there also has to be a continuity as represented by the president, for example, of the board. There's numerous different features of this, but I think the most important, let's go to the next slide. Is up there okay? Oh, I'm sorry. Well, let's just go ahead and skip over this one. We can come back to it. Yeah. Go ahead, move ahead. All right, here we go. So we're starting with number 20, XX. All right. The bills and notes of the bank that will be issued by this bank that's being set up, originally made payable or which shall have become payable on demand in gold and silver coin, shall be receivable in all payments to the United States. That is, for taxes and other purposes. The government will accept these notes. So they're good as gold, including to the government, which is a problem with so-called land banks set up by various states, which are not really banks, but they were just, lending based on land. But the government couldn't accept that because you couldn't value the land because people couldn't even buy land. I mean,
It's like when the British government started accepting tally sticks as payment for taxes, but then tally sticks, inspecting them. At that point in time, right? So people don't
Yeah. 21. This is more important. Just in terms of just this, ensuring the uprightness of the functioning of the bank. The officer at the head of the Treasury Department, at that time himself, Hamilton, shall be furnished from time to time, as often as he may require, not exceeding once a week, with statements of the amount of the capital stock of the bank and of the debts due to the same, of the money deposited therein, of the notes in circulation, and of the cash in hand, and shall have a right to inspect such general accounts in the books of the bank It shall relate to the said statements, provided that this shall not be construed to imply the right of inspecting this account, the account of any private individual or individuals of the bank. In other words, the government will have oversight of the bank even though it's not running the bank. Right? Move on to the next one. And this is the most kind of elliptical, difficult part of the national bank operation to grasp fully. 24 here. And lastly, this is now the funding of the bank. This is the funding of a bank at $10 million. This is what's being set up here. What was proposed by him and which was what was then set up. The President of the United States shall be authorized to cause a subscription to be made to the stock of the said company, that is of the bank, on behalf of the United States to an amount not exceeding $2 million. That would be in specie, silver and gold. To be paid out of the monies which shall be borrowed by virtue of either of the acts, the government acts, the one entitled an act making provision for the debt of the United States, and the other entitled an act making provision for the reduction of the public debt. Okay, so the government's going to put $2 million into the bank buying stock in the bank of the $2 billion of the $10 billion in capital that's starting the bank. But then, the government will then simultaneously borrow of the bank an equal sum to be applied to the purposes for which the said monies shall have been procured, reimbursable in 10 years by equal annual installments, or at any time sooner or in any greater proportions than the government may think fit. I think, can you go to the next one? I think it's a continuation. It's related. Okay, so what does he propose? What was he just proposing? And maybe you should go back so it's in front of everybody. Thanks. Okay. The government, U.S. government, is going to put $2 million worth of gold and silver, specie, at least that's the appearances, into the bank. I'll come back to that in a second. Into the bank. So that is going to be gold and silver in the bank. Okay? Then on the other hand, it's going to take $2 million out, so the government still has $2 million. It's now, though, in the form of a loan from the bank. It's in the form of banknotes, not in terms of gold and silver. So then the government can go ahead and do what it wants with that money, although it's going to be paying an interest on the money. On the other hand, it's going to be making money on the stock. The stock will pay an interest. Otherwise, the stock will go up in value, which it did. It went from, $25 bank share. There's another word they use, but a share went from $25 up to $100 within a matter of weeks. But so the government will be paying interest on the loan, but it'll be making money, in fact, more money, on its investment in the bank. So the government's not out anything. But what's the key here? The key here, it goes back to a point we were discussing earlier, that if you have money in the bank, the money can be used by other people while you're not using it yourself. Secondly, it goes to this point of silver and gold species and so forth, and the fetish around that, which was what had been created was the conditions by the devaluation of paper script, the various forms during the American Revolutionary War period, where people said, we can only count on what's real, which is gold and silver, or land maybe. But that gold or silver is what you had to have. Okay. Well, to set up a bank now. Okay, you've got the Constitution. You've stabilized the debt, the credit of the United States. You're now setting up a national bank. You've got to be able to show that this bank is backed by silver and gold. It's got hard stuff in the bank. Doesn't sound so strange, right? You still have people today talking about, well, is there any gold left in Fort Knox? I mean, is there anything, right? And so in this, and the problem was there wasn't any gold or silver in the country. It wasn't to be had. You couldn't put together $10 billion in the United States from private subscribers, much less put $10 million or a large portion of it in terms of gold and silver. You couldn't pull it together in one place. So by involving the government in doing it, that helps solve the problem. And by doing it in terms of what he calls dollars here, which is, by this he's referencing gold and silver, you're backing up the bank. You're putting the gold and silver into the vault, so to speak. So this then, based on this $10 million purchased in terms of people investing in the bank and buying these, becoming shareholders in the bank, and the government coming into the bank, particularly with gold and silver, the bank was off and running. And the bank, as a consequence, became the clearinghouse for the government. It collected taxes. People paid their taxes at the bank. The bank was located in one place, but it had branches on the major ports along the coast, so it was also the clearinghouse for customs, for tariffs, collection, and so forth. Payments made by the government were paid through the bank. So the government had accounts at the bank, and through that money was transferred from branch to branch of the bank. It was the only bank in town, so to speak. It was the national bank. So it carried out all those activities. It carried out lending, to commercial lending, to people, to businesses, to merchants, for trade, for manufacturing, for plant and equipment. All of those kinds of activities it carried on. I'm just trying to make sure I'm just giving, well, that gives you a sense of it. I mean, it was the largest, by far, bank in the United States. I mean, it was the major lending capacity of the United States. And it carried out a rudimentary monetary policy, if you will, but not monetarist policy. But by prioritizing manufacturing and agriculture, that is the progress of the nation in real terms, by prioritizing that in terms of lending, in conjunction with tariff policies and other policies that were already in place, the real economy of the United States was able to grow at an extraordinary rate. Because of the combination, again, of the Constitution, the restabilization of the public credit, and therefore the circulation of the government bonds as currency, which created liquidity, and then by the banknotes issued by the bank, a multiple, 3-4 times the actual capital of the bank, to further increase the liquidity of the economy. And so this is how the U.S. economy grew and retired its debt, and grew out of the what was existential crisis, really, in which we found ourselves at the end of the American Revolution. And as such, this is not a bank modeled on the Bank of England. The Bank of England, the government didn't have any investment in the bank, didn't have any ownership in the bank. I mean, there's many other features that are different, but this was an entirely new institution. And remember, this is not something that he just dreamed up. This is what he, as Secretary of Treasury, then oversaw. Not the bank, he didn't run the bank, but he, as the Secretary of Treasury, was running the tax collection for the excise taxes, the tariffs, and all this. He organized the Treasury departments, efficiently to collect those revenues so that the debts were paid. He oversaw to ensure that the bank was operating, as required under the Constitution, under the law enacted by the U.S. Congress, and made law by the signature of George Washington, February 20th, 25th, 1791. There's more, I'm sure, and I'm sure you have questions, so let me in there.
I just have one thing I think just to point out. It's kind of interesting that in this section 24, it appears to me that from what he's saying, the United States, under the two acts specified there, is going to borrow money from probably Europe.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you brought that up.
Deposit that in the bank, or buy shares in the bank with the money that the United States government has borrowed, buy the shares in the bank, and then borrow the $2 million back to conduct government affairs in whatever manner. So
okay, well here, let me, it is. Because there wasn't even the gold and silver.
Right.
The $2 million in gold and silver didn't even exist. What happened was, I found this in a book on the early history of banking in the United States, from the American Revolution to the Civil War. Make sure I get the right. Yeah. In effect, here's the explanation of what happened, the $2 million. In effect, the Treasury drew for $2 million on the United States commissioners engaged in selling government securities in Amsterdam, Holland. Not Amsterdam, New York. Amsterdam, Holland. All right? I'll start that again. In effect, the Treasury drew for $2 million on the United States commissioners engaged in selling government securities in Amsterdam, deposited the drafts with the bank, piece of paper.
Right.
They deposited it in the bank, and then drew against the deposit to pay for the stock. Technically, this consummated the purchase of the stock with funds borrowed in Europe. But it was not desired to have the drafts go through and the specie shipped from Europe, because it would have to have been shipped back for other purposes. So the Treasury borrowed the $2 million from the bank and used the amount to take up the drafts on the commissioners, with which the whole transaction was open. The net effect was therefore to leave the government in possession of $2 million of bank stock and in debt to the bank for $2 million, though technically the money owing to the bank had not been used to buy the stock, but to restore the funds in Amsterdam, which had been used for that purpose. I mean, this is what again and again, the Bank of North America earlier had to do virtually the same thing, because there was no golden specie. But people had to think there had to be golden specie. You had to come as close as you could, and everybody agreed to basically make the thing work, by kind of pulling it. One person I read called it pulling yourself up by the bootstraps. Here was a really a country pulling itself up by the bootstraps.
Do they even consider the possibility of using anything other than gold and silver, as a basis for money?
Well, the only, there's a long history to it, but because of because of the problems, as we keep mentioning, that were involved in the period of the American Revolution immediately afterwards, the other options were not there. You can go all the way back to the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the pine tree shilling, where the idea was first begun in the world, as far as we know, of circulating, essentially money, coin money or paper money for that matter, which was not represented in the actual value of the coinage, right? And just using it as we would use a silver certificate or a Federal Reserve note today. But because of the American Revolutionary War period, script, paper money had confidence had been lost in. Likewise, land. I mentioned it briefly. states, for example, in a number of states set up so-called land banks, in which the government issued, just basically paper based on land put forward, as if in a mortgage to the state to put money into circulation, or they used land, wilderness land, or whatever that the state owned, and they issued currency against that land as what made the paper worth something.
What told me makes sense.
Huh?
I said, land makes sense to me, I'm not telling you much.
Well, no, but again, like I said, because of the collapse of the economy, people couldn't even sell
One
land.
of the things that had happened was.
So land, in other words, land isn't something you can put in your pocket, right? Land, it has to be sold, and to be sold, it has to find a buyer, and that may take a year, 2 years, 3 years, right? So you can't rely on
The
it.
English had been counterfeiting the Continental during the Revolutionary War to such an extent that it became worthless, right? It was manipulation. You would think that, as soon as we just started issuing banknotes on this new bank, you have to worry about counterfeiting as well. Tell me if I'm wrong, right?
Well, I don't know of any history on that. I'm sure there's history on that. But that's why, there was Treasury agents were created under the Treasury Department
It must have taken extreme measures.
to collect taxes, there was, because people obviously tried to avoid paying taxes of different excise taxes on whiskey. You can imagine, there's the whiskey rebellion. There's all kinds of it. So I'm sure there was, a problem, but it was not. It never, hardly ever comes up. So it wasn't a substantial problem. That's all.
During the Revolutionary War itself, it
Oh, well, with the British, I'm sure that was. But again, Hamilton, for example, and I don't know at least from what I've read, obviously I haven't read everything, but from what I've read, it didn't come up as a major subject in the Congress or in Hamilton's writings. It doesn't come up at all. That the problem with the Continental was that of counterfeit. As the cause of devaluation. It was simply the fact that too many Continentals were handed out, as script because, food was needed, provisions were needed, and they had to be gotten, or the army would cease to exist, for example, or the government would cease to function, what little government there was. So, there was no there was no option.
I was just going to say that the trick here is what he said in the previous one, which is that. So once they have this $2 million in the bank, they loan $2 million back to the government, but then they can also loan, what he says, 2 to 3 times, another $2 to $4
Is this saying that
million
the
dollars
president should be authorized or should be required?
I'm sorry?
Is this saying that the president should be authorized or should be required to deposit this $2 million in the bank and then take back the?
Well, this is in his proposal, shall be authorized. I imagine that's how it reads in the actual law, but I'm not sure of that. We'll come back to it in the next week or two, depending on how we work out a schedule on this, because I'm just dealing with really 2 of the papers here, and I'm really encouraging you to read the papers yourself, because I'm only giving you a sketch of what's in the papers. They're really wonderful, a wonderful read.
So you're basically trying to come as close as you can, given the circumstances, to make people believe that the money they're talking about creating is as good as if they actually had gold and silver there.
Right, but with the real understanding, as he emphasizes himself, and he argues this in his defense of the National Bank, his 3rd paper. Washington had doubts about the National Bank, its constitutionality, because Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson, not Aaron Burr, Randolph, I think it was, in his cabinet were arguing against. They were saying this is unconstitutional. We can't have a national. These were the so-called agrarian interests. This is the slave interest. This is the slave interest, and they're opposed to industry. They're opposed to industrial and scientific progress. Let me just read this, and I'll come back to I'll finish answering. This is what Jefferson wrote in 1785 to a correspondent in the Netherlands. He said, that if I were to indulge my own theory in terms of the wish for the United States, I would wish the United States to practice neither commerce nor navigation, but to stand with respect to Europe precisely on the footing of China.
That doesn't sound like a happy end.
Did you get that? I mean, you know the condition of China at that time, right? This is what Jefferson is saying in 1785.
That's not smart.
No. Okay. So they were leaning on Washington. Washington's the arbiter. Washington is absolutely loyal, and he has the loyalty of the New York administration, the crowd around Hamilton and Gouverneur Morris and Livingston and Jay and so forth, and those that followed him. And but he has questions about the constitutionality. So Hamilton writes a response, and what he emphasizes in that is the government, bearing on the preamble of the Constitution in particular, but that the government has the prerogative and in fact the responsibility to provide direction for the development of the country. And what is not, precluded absolutely in writing is left as a power for the government to act upon. And so this argument of Washington's, I'll come back to it in the next week or two so we can be more precise, but Washington is won over by Hamilton's arguments. Of course, he's always thought highly of Hamilton, and so he signs it. He signs the National Bank into law, right? So, it's. I've forgotten your question, or there's a feature of your question I wanted to address, but maybe that answers it, or an implication of your question.
Because, like, when I read, try to read about Hamilton on the internet, right, and I see a lot of leftists, a lot of people that you wouldn't call Republican conservative, like that,
right,
who view Hamilton as an arch-villain.
Right.
So this is mainly because.
And it started with Jefferson and Randolph and the slaveocracy. No, that's where the argument started.
That's not why they do it.
Well, it is. They just don't know it.
Private ownership of this national bank, right, in the manner which it was owned, in the manner which, it was seen when rich private individuals have fat cats, some of the people that everybody hates,
right.
Whereas by the same
yes,
token,
but those were the arguments made by the slaveocracy. It's like today we say, we have people saying, we have Hillary Clinton saying Vladimir Putin is Adolf Hitler. Well, Hillary Clinton should look in a mirror. Literally, right?
I mean, I would side,
it's the pot calling the kettle black.
Okay, I would side with you guys on this. Okay, it's like from everything I've been able to do in return. What it sounds like is what you guys are saying, which makes more sense to me, is that the question of who owns this bank is less important than the question of what the bank is doing and what its priorities are and what its objectives are. And you talk about an institution that's basically brought this country from eating off wood. Wood-burning stoves, being a major industrialized power.
Well, and let me add this. We skipped over it, partly for time, but in the National Bank paper, could you go back?
Sure.
He specifically says it's right. I think it's one more. Yes, the emitting of paper money by the authority of the government, directly by the government, is wisely prohibited in the individual states by the national constitution, that is, states can't issue currency, right? That's under the Constitution, that's not outlined. Okay, but then he goes on. And the spirit of that prohibition ought not to be disregarded by the government of the United States. Though paper emissions under a general authority might have some advantages not applicable, and be free from some disadvantages which are applicable to the same emissions by the states separately, yet they are of a nature so liable to abuse, and it may even be affirmed so certain of being abused, that the wisdom of the government will be shown in never trusting itself with the use of so seducing and dangerous an expedient. In other words, again, what he's concerned about is, it comes back to this question of the confidence of the Congress, the confidence of the American people. After what they've been through, you've got to protect your institution that's going to be emitting the credit of the country from being as he put it, abused, right? Or we'll be right back in hell again. And if we're back in hell again, we'll be run over by the British Empire again. This is not an abstract question, right? I mean, we barely won the damn thing in the first place. So under the circumstances, now he later in letters, he speaks of he actually says, well, it perhaps would be good for the government to consider now issuing Treasury notes, from the U.S. Treasury to circulate. So it's not a blind prohibition.
Who has the legal authority to pay money?
Well, the legal authority, and what will work given the climate, the state of affairs, right? The state of the nation. How do you advance the nation? It's not a question, well, science and technology advances the nation, but also, taking this into account the state of mind of people, what they're capable of understanding, what they're capable of supporting for the right reasons and so forth. How can we move this forward? And so under these conditions, at the time of proposing the National Bank, he's specifically saying we can't let the government run it because it'll be abused. We've already seen this. The people have seen this. So we've got to put a wall around it. We've got to protect it. But then he builds into the actual proposal very specific measures to try to make it as open and transparent to the Congress, to the Department of Treasury, to the American people, because he knows that he's going to be hit by these attacks coming from the slavocracy. He's in a war with the slavocracy from the get-go, during the American Revolution. Aaron Burr, and him are tangling. Aaron Burr was kicked out of Valley Forge by Washington. And they're tangling all the way through. And of course, Aaron Burr, effectively assassinates him in the so-called duel. And that ends Hamilton's life, in his 40s, mid-40s or so. So he's in a battle with the slavocracy and the British backers of the slavocracy. And he knows, he doesn't know they're going to gun for him. They're already gunning for him. They tried to kick him out of Valley Forge. They tried to involve him in I think it was called the Conway Cabal, implicate him essentially as a traitor to Washington in the middle of Valley Forge in the dead of winter. And he's like 20 years old, So he's building these things in from the standpoint of, being involved in real hand-to-hand combat, real warfare, for the sake of the nation.
To me, the thing that there's a question in my mind and I can't formulate it, and it has to do with the fact that the institution that he's creating, that he wants to create, how do you put it into law what the intention is? Because financial institutions, as this paragraph here makes fairly clear, they're liable to be used for good or bad. Right? It's like scientific discoveries. Scientific discoveries can be used for good, they can be used for bad. And what the battle is, how do you establish the kind of cultural environment where people who will be running the bank are running it for the development of the nation and not for just primitive accumulation. Just stealing.
Again, that's been the fight ever since, right? The first national bank was put out of business, right, and then brought back, and then put out again a business again by the slavocracy, by the oligarchy, and use populist mobs as part of the battering ram, and then Lincoln brought back the policy with the greenbacks, which was government issued currency. So, we had to go to a different form, And then Roosevelt brought it back with the Reconstruction Finance Corporation as a mechanism to issue, credit, government credit out into the economy, at the point that the banks had failed in 33, 34. So again, this is the battle, right? I mean, but it isn't in your terms. It's a question of the aesthetic education. It's the cultural issues, like we had the other night. The event we had the other Saturday. And we have one coming up on November 12th. The Requiem concerts in New York that spurred the Jasta fight. It is this intangible. It's this elevation of the human spirit.
That's another question. Look, it's like, what the biggest single question running through this whole thing is like who and where. Shall this power create might reside, right? Who shall have this power? Obviously, it's like, my way of thinking, I don't want the Democratic Party having the power to create money just to use to buy votes, right? It's obvious, right? Nonetheless, can I ask your opinion of this idea on grounds, when it says that, this is public banking foundation, which you read about, right? And the idea is that, the best place to have power to create money is at the state or county level, just like that's particularly that state bank in North Dakota. It seems to be the most major reason that they have not participated in all degree the last 20, 30 years or so.
Well, I mean, North Dakota, we have friends in North Dakota. I mean, North Dakota is a devastated state. I mean, if it wasn't for fracking and whatever, they'd be worshipped, I guess, in terms of the revenue stream. But,
the state bank says they always have money for anything meaningful we want to try to do. They have to go calling Wall Street for money.
I think that the short, you asked my opinion, I'd say, look, then you're right back where we started from. At the time of the American Revolution, even before the American Revolution, you had states, issuing currency, and then instead of having, the question of one government, abusing or not abusing, you had 13 governments, abusing or not abusing. I mean, you multiplied the problems.
So it says that you just find a way to make to make the national monetary system bulletproof.
Right, because it is tied, as you were bringing up in a different way, the question of national defense. Because if you don't have, you've got to have we have to have the power to defend ourselves, not just from enemies abroad, but natural catastrophe, and other forms that can take. And so where are the resources for the national defense going to come from? One of the things that was motivating the Congress, not just Hamilton, but the Congress, and of course Washington as a general as well as president, was the defense of the nation going forward. And you couldn't, and it was, the argument was transparent, and it was reason for the Constitutional Convention. 13 colonies were being played against each other, not just by creditors, and lenders and wheeler dealers, right? But by the British, French agents, agents of the oligarchy.
This is even
after the revolution, yeah. So you either pulled the goddamn, excuse the French, but you either pulled the damn thing together, or we were gonna sink separately.
Some of this is what you see, like with these arsenals, like Springfield and like West Virginia, Harper's Ferry, right? Have you ever seen a foul rifle? Not a foul rifle, I'm sorry, like a ball rifle. Well,
why don't we end the meeting here, so we want to talk.